I would have had a very different experience if when I showed up to Google, someone was like, hey, stay in your lane and like, don't go and solve these problems for developers. There has never been a better moment in human history to be a developer and someone who enjoys building things. If you are the founder of a developer tooling company, you should go and talk directly to the developers. Don't hire a marketing team. Don't hire a DevRel team. Like as long as humanly possible, you should be the person who's engaging the ecosystem and community.
Logan, it's great to see you. How you doing?
Likewise, Hano. I'm excited to be here. I'm excited to chat.
Yeah, likewise. It's been so interesting watching your career. I think you take such a thoughtful approach to communities and developers and engagement. And you've had a seat at you know, two very significant companies in this space, most recently, obviously at OpenAI and at Google. The first thing I'd love to kind of get into is what has been the biggest shift for you from going to OpenAI to Google, both culturally or in terms of the tech? Like, yeah, I'd love you to kind of peel that onion a little bit.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think my OpenAI experience was very much so. The historical context is I started interviewing at OpenAI probably like June of 2022 or something like that. So well before like GPT-4 internally had just finished training. I had also at that time just left California and moved back to Chicago to be with my girlfriend in Chicago. So it was a very slow interview process because they're like, do we really want to hire this guy remotely? So I ended up being ultimately, I ended up getting hired, ended up being one of the first external people, or one of the first non-SF people who was hired. And all of that lead up to my first day was ChatGPT hitting 1 million users. And I was originally brought in to help solve this problem of like, how do we help? At the time, OpenAI had seen what was going to happen with GPT-4. They knew the model was really good, but at that time, the only like use cases that had actually hit mainstream was like Copy AI and Jasper AI, which were essentially doing marketing copywriting. And they knew that there was going to be more. So they're like, how do we start planting the seeds to get people ready for GPT-4? Um, and I think like I showed up and all of a sudden that was not the problem anymore. The problem was something very different, which is like the world was blowing up with ChatGPT. It was now a question of like, do we actually have the right developer product and how do we build trust with developers and create this ecosystem and all this stuff. So it ended up being like a very interesting, I think actually for me in hindsight, like a lot more fun. Like I do think like traditional developer advocacy is like an interesting job. And I'd done the like, before OpenAI had spent like 4 years helping, which is how I became familiar with your content and had seen all the work that you were doing, leading ecosystem and community for the open source Julia programming language. And this was like the most difficult developer advocacy top of funnel job I could have possibly imagined because it was like a very niche programming language. Like no one really knew. It was tough. It was a very, very difficult job. So from the like truly developer advocacy perspective, showing up at OpenAI was the easiest thing ever because everyone wanted the models that we had. It was a different problem space, I think, and got to like live through that. And I think coming to Google was again it was much more similar to my Julia experience where we had Google's developer rep, specifically around Gemini, was like not super positive when I initially joined. So got to like try to figure out how do we sort of reboot this? How do we turn this into product momentum? And happy to like deep dive on this story, but like I think it was just a very different environment from when I joined OpenAI to when I joined Google.
Yeah. And I imagine as well that there's a shift from going from very much of a startup to go into a bigger company and navigating the dynamics of that did that play a role in this? Because I can only imagine what it must have been like in those days at OpenAI where everybody's hair's on fire and just trying to stay on top of this huge level of momentum that's kind of going down. And on one hand, that can be great because you can execute quickly, you can move fast, but on the other hand, it can be erratic and it can be complicated, right? But then, of course, the flip side of bigger organizations is sometimes there's layers of like approvals and things that you have to go through. How was that shift as well?
Yeah, there's so much nuance to this story, which I don't know I don't know how much we want to spend deep diving on this, but just like a couple of examples of this, which if folks haven't lived through this, it might not resonate, but like it feels very visceral for me. One of them is like joining. Well, so one, I was when I joined Google to lead this team, was the first person hired. So like it felt like I was starting from scratch. Like it was literally like me, my boss hired me, and it was like we're building a team from scratch. And
Yeah.
we were the product had actually already existed. The Google Labs team created AI Studio and the Gemini API, which I took over running. But none of those people actually came with us when it sort of graduated out of Google Labs. So it was like truly a here's the code, here's the product, here's the user base, go and run with this thing and like figure it all
Yeah.
out. So like it
Right.
felt from that perspective, it was like very startup-y. And like
The
I
thing seemed very startup-y. Yeah.
yeah, like I got to relive this 0 to 1 experience again, which I really loved. And like literally, I joined Google and we had like 30,000 developers using the platform, $0 in revenue, and like seeing that scale up to millions and,
Yeah.
many millions of dollars in revenue. All that is like a very like deja vu version of the experience that I had at OpenAI. It was just a different, the starting place was different from like a perception standpoint. So I think there's a lot of nuance in that perception story. But to
Mm.
hit again on this like difference between Google and OpenAI, I think like all jobs and working with people involves politics. I think the politics were a different flavor in these situations, which I think at Google is like because it was an established organization, it was actually relatively static. So it's easier to like navigate because there's like well-established norms and it's not a new company and all this stuff. I think it was actually much more difficult at OpenAI because it was like so much was changing. Everything was on fire. There's like 10 new leaders in this one space and there's 5 new leaders in that space. And it's like
Yeah.
none of them have figured out yet what their ethos is and what they're trying to do and what their strategy is. And you're trying to navigate all that versus like there is a benefit for somebody who's trying to move fast to like having a little bit more. I think about it like the battlefield is like well established. You have this kind of like top level
Yeah.
view of what's going on.
Yeah. I can totally see that as well because it seems to me that, I mean, Google obviously kind of really grew up. I would argue in a much more organized and agile way than a lot of other companies. Like I know a lot of people who've worked at Google in the past. One of the things they've said is it's astonishing how much you can get done at Google compared to some other companies that they'd worked at that have been around a lot longer. I mean, even like Google kind of like pioneering like some of the work in OKRs and things like that for just organizing work. It doesn't particularly surprise me, but I imagine it can be challenging with the kind of work that you do because it seems like we see this with the companies we work with at StayShift that, building great engagement with developers or other people touches so many different aspects, right? There's documentation and there's onboarding and there's product and there's content and there's all these different pieces. It sounds like you've been able to weave those components together reasonably efficiently at Google, right? Because sometimes that's where things grind to a halt. I've seen with some other companies.
Yeah, this has not been easy, but I think to give so many folks at Google the credit they deserve, I think so many people have been willing to collaborate on this and make that happen because I completely agree. I think like my worldview of developers' experience does not stop in like what the code is that you see or some pixel on it. It's like everything. It's like what are we doing from a marketing perspective? What does it look like when you reach out to us via customer support? What does the link look like that you're clicking on a page for us? Like it's like every single detail. And I do think it is like somewhat, this is what makes it challenging. And this is why you need to have, and like I've been fortunate to have like a bunch of leaders who I've reported to have like empowered me to like go and, sort of ruffle all the feathers to like go the entire breadth and scope of all the work that needs to be done to actually have a great experience. And like we haven't actually solved all those things yet. So like not to like take credit for accomplishing this, but like we at least know what those things are and are pushing the rock up the hill on many of them. Um,
Yeah.
and it's I also this is the thing that I love. Like that's the most fun to me. Like I think if I was like I would have had a very different experience if when I showed up to Google, someone was like, "Hey, stay in your lane and like don't go and solve these problems for developers." I think what I was told was like, "Go and solve the problem for developers at whatever the cost is. We'll go and solve that problem," which I think was refreshing for me as somebody who wants to just like go and push on stuff.
Yeah, because it seems like so many times when I've seen people, I'll be honest with you, when I first read that you'd moved to Google, the first thing I thought was like, this is great. Google did great work. You're great. You did great work. This seems like a great pairing, but I've never worked directly for Google. So, and I was a little worried that, when I've seen people go from doing amazing work in startups to bigger companies, that they can't, like, the machine can grind them down and slow them down. It's great to hear that that's not being getting away. How the ruffling of the feathers thing, I think, is really interesting, because I think one of the things that I love about this kind of work um, is by definition to have success, we got to stand out. We've got to be different, right? We can't. Everyone's doing the same stuff out there on the internet. So by definition, we've got to kind of like mix things up a little bit, and that will require getting people outside of their comfort zones, and that can be tricky in any organization, whether it's OpenAI or Google. How do you approach that? Like, how have you ruffled the feathers in a way that's productive and proactive, as opposed to just pissing people off? You know?
Yeah, this is actually a great question. And I think the short answer is I don't have the perfect solution to this. I think one of the things that, like, candidly, I get to sort of lean on my credibility in the developer ecosystem, which I think has bought me like a little bit of goodwill where like people know my heart's in the right place. But I do think like my like to self-reflect, my growth opportunity is like doing this in a more tactical way because I when I try to solve problems, I run at them 100 miles an hour, like full force. And I do it in a way that I think sometimes like doesn't perfectly bring people along with me. And I think I could be more tactical and artful about doing this. I think that the challenge for me is like it's like as clear as day. It's like as clear as I see the sun outside. I see these problems and and I just like don't have it in me to not move super quickly to try to solve them, which I do think rubs people the wrong way. And I think just like continuing to opine on this, um, ultimately, like I'm here to help make developers successful, which is ultimately in the best interest of Google. And like I say this to people 25 times a week, that like my job at Google is to make developers successful. And like by, the fact of doing that, this will make Google successful. And I think there's other people who are on that same page. And I think for people who are on that same page, it's like very easy to like, um, to be on the same board. Someone at OpenAI said to me one time, which has always stuck with me, that like when you're in full on sprint mode, you will inevitably step on people's toes. The important thing to know is like the important reflection is that you're all in full on sprint mode, and like you're in full on sprint mode because you're passionate and excited about this work, and not because you're trying to like screw over other people or something like that. So it is. Yeah, but it happens. I think you just need to like continually remind yourself that people's toes are going to be stepped on, but that's just like the byproduct of moving quickly.
Yeah. But you've also got, like, I'm sure anyone watching this will be able to see this immediately, even if they've never seen you speak before. Like, your demeanor, your personality, the way in which you come across has huge levels of authenticity. So I can imagine, even if you do, step on people's toes and you don't mean to, or that people will understand that it's coming from the right place. Because we've all experienced when it doesn't come from the right place, and that's I think where it can cause a lot of challenges, and frustration. I think people just have different clock speeds as well, right? Like, some people just work at a different rate than other folks, and it seems like that can be also like a little tricky in navigating towards outcomes as well. So
Yeah. One of the things that I think has helped with this, and I don't know, this is 100% like a privileged position to be in, and not even that like I have, I could go and retire and sail off into the sunset right now. It's not like I have like generational wealth or something like that. But I do think like the demeanor that I often show up with is like I'm willing to put everything on the line because of how much I believe in this direction that we're going. And like if that doesn't work out, like my delusional belief is that there'll be some other opportunity somewhere else for me, but like I truly am willing to show up and put everything on the line for the thing that I believe in.
yeah,
um and I think like actually one believing that that's true, and showing up like that, I think has been really, I mean, again, it requires, I'd have to self-reflect on how I got to that place, but I think it actually works really, really well. Like I think people can see that and be like, okay, actually, I don't have that level of conviction. I trust your conviction. Let's go with it. And it's been helpful to see that play out.
yeah, and that, I imagine, can be tricky as well because it obviously like you're comfortable in your own skin, and again, like you're super authentic, and that comes across in droves. But I can also imagine that, and we've all faced this, right? Where you're in a situation where there can be that kind of internal pressure to I have to show up in a certain way or appear in a certain way, and I think that can especially be the case in bigger tech companies as well. It takes, in my mind, like some courage to be able to do that, right? To just be to be yourself and say, look, this is who I am, and if for whatever reason this doesn't map out, I'll go somewhere else and it'll work there.
Yeah, Jono, I have a question. How many people generally watch these videos? Because I'm curious how candid I can be about just generally my perspective.
Usually, I mean, the channel is about 10,000 subscribers. How many people watch this? I mean, I don't want you to put yourself in. I don't want you to get yourself in trouble. But
No, no, it
you can
won't
be
be
as
in.
candid.
Yeah, it won't be
Yeah.
in trouble. I think my general comment or reaction to that was, I think this is something that I think about all the time because I am like at the same time that I'm juggling, I'm doing this juggling act of like
Mm,
being a leader, but also like constantly being reminded that like I'm 27 and like I'm incredibly early career and like have been doing this my like for all not all that long. And it's this weird like this has actually been the
yeah.
most challenging thing for me is like people believe me on one hand, and then I'm always self-reflecting of like, should they actually be believing me about this, or like, do I actually have the expertise that that person thinks that I do? And then it's this
Mm,
like, fine line to walk as I go through and I navigate this
yeah.
stuff. And I think more and more people have showed up and like expected, more of me, which I think has made this even more challenging.
Right. Yeah. I mean, yeah, because you've had a lot of success, right? And you're very visible. But I mean, this is just my opinion, so take it with a pinch of salt. But I wouldn't even worry about that. Like, you're enormously credible, I think, in what you do, and your work speaks for itself. To me, if you're one of the, like we see a lot of these people out there, where they project a big, loud public image, and they're constantly investing in their personal brand, trying to almost become like internet personalities. And I think that is where I tend to have a lot more skepticism. But I think people who show up and just do good work, and what I love about your work as well, and the way you talk, Logan, is you're openly vulnerable. Like you'll say, you know what, yeah, I'm still figuring out this journey. I think people who aren't trustworthy generally don't do that. I would say. Um, to me, trust is an interesting element of this conversation because I wanted to ask you about this. We're living in this like really fascinating era with developers where rightly a lot of developers are a bit worried about AI because they're worried that their jobs are going to be taken away from them. But then it's also the most exciting time to be a developer because you can focus on the stuff that's really exciting. One of the things that struck me about software engineering in recent years is that I think a lot of the fun's been sucked out of it because like when we were growing up and you were like learning how to program, you just write code. And now it's like this continuous integration and deployment, and there's all these things that are weaved around it. And it seems to me like AI is able to take a lot of that grunt work out and to focus developers back on the creativity and the fun and the engineering. So we're in this like weird modality of trust, right? Like on one hand, skeptical about AI or worried about AI, but on the other hand, trust it and it's exciting. How do you define developer trust in the era of AI?
Yeah, it's a tough question. I think it's there's so many elements at play when you look at this. I think I'll share my personal beliefs and then we can opine on some of these points specifically. Like one,
Yeah.
I do like to double click on what you said. Like there has never been a better moment in human history to be a developer and someone who enjoys building things than right now. It's like there's a thousand tools, all your workflows are being accelerated. As somebody who always like um had a lot like the reason I spent my time doing developer relations stuff and like answering Stack Overflow questions was just this like overwhelming feeling of empathy for other developers who were in that
Mm,
like stuck moment and that like this thing doesn't work and I wish it worked because it's something I'm excited about, but it just doesn't. And
yeah.
I think about myself learning to code in that position all the time, where like I learned C++, and I've told this story before, but I remember like calling my mom in like freshman year of college and being like, "Hey, I don't know if I should do computer science because this sucks. I don't pointer whoever invented pointers in C++, take
Oh my
away
God.
their take away
Yeah.
their Nobel Peace Prize in CS or whatever they got for inventing C++ because this is terrible to experience." Um, and I think that that's been so rooted in like how I view this developer world. And I think it is true that I think what building software and what being a developer means is changing as these tools are changing. I think this is the like interesting observation, and I haven't like personally lived through a bunch of these transformations, but like reflecting on the history of building software, like this is not a new thing that's happened. I think like it
Mm,
maybe is slightly different than some of the previous transformations, but like what it looked like to build software 30 years ago, and what it looks like to build software today, or like 2 years ago, minus all the AI stuff, to what it
yeah.
looks like to today are like fundamentally different, but like it's not unexpected that they're fundamentally different because everything else has shifted so much. Um,
Yeah.
so I think there has to be this like willingness to like acknowledge and sort of embrace some of the change that's coming. Um,
Yeah.
and then my personal worldview is like this skill set does not diminish in value being able to like write code and solve problems because like
Oh,
fundamentally it's a problem solving skill. It's like a creative building skill. There's like all of these layers of like why computer science and building software like teaches you the art of thinking and building and like resiliency. I think about resiliency so much. I'm like, every time I write code, there's a 60% chance the code's not going to work. How often do you get that? Like what else in life do you get a flywheel and a feedback loop like that? Like if you just go and like speak or write or do any of these other things, like you're oftentimes never given that flywheel of feedback. You need like a human expert to give it to you or something like that. And that happens. So I
yeah.
think developers are like so well suited for this, just for like life in general, because of all of these different mechanisms of being a developer. Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah,
It's super exciting, I think, because in my mind, the thing that made it's so funny you mentioned C++ because I started out with C++ as well. And I remember going to night school.
same. This was a night school class where I was learning C++, John. So
You're
we're
kidding.
on the same experience. Might have been the same
Yeah.
class.
Right. I remember going to night school, and the reason why I wanted to learn C++ was because when I was growing up, I idolized people who made video games, and I read in like, you know, I don't know what it was, like some magazine when I was growing up that games were written in C++. So I enrolled in night school. I was 16 and went there, and it was so complicated and confusing. I understood the principles of logic and code, but like you were saying, when you started getting into like memory management and pointers, and you'd have like when you said about the empathy there, when there'd be like one thing that was your code wasn't compiling, and it was some stupid reason why, like you left a semicolon off somewhere, or there was some other issue. You were so close to where you wanted to get to. But to me, what was interesting about that relates to what you were saying is the reason why coding was so exciting was because it gave you agency, right? Is that you're like, I have an idea and I can actually translate that idea into something that I can build, that I can share with other people, which to me made open source so interesting. And that's what excites me about agency in the age of AI, because like my son's 12 and he's building full apps, and he's able to do more now because of AI than he would have been able to do if it wasn't because of AI. And yes, he's vibe coding some of this stuff, but I think more importantly, he's able to tap into his agency, and that's what makes it, and for me especially, exciting. You know,
Yeah, and it gets you like this is one of those threads where it gets you farther, it gets you to the aha moment, like back to that C++ class. Like, had there been like part of the challenge when you're learning to code is this, you don't see the light at the end of the tunnel because the light at the end of the tunnel is, you know, some crazy building like a Fortnite version of game, which is like, what a game many people get excited about. Like that is like a very far distant light at the end of the tunnel. And like it's hard to
Yep.
imagine as I'm sitting here struggling to just get my Hello World C++ program to compile that I'm actually going to be able to build something like that. And I feel like
Right.
AI is doing a lot of this work of like helping people get closer to that aha moment so that they're like,
Yeah.
oh no, I can actually do this. And I should go to the depth of learning how all this works because that could be me building that game in the future and like doing it faster than before. And like I've had so many conversations with people um earlier in my life where like it was like very clear that this was the thing that was stopping them. They're like, oh no, like coding's not for me. And I feel that I think this happens with like math and science as well, which is like what's the light at the end of the tunnel of like math is or some
Yeah.
science job is you're like actually doing something interesting in a lab and it's like a cool environment. And like to get there, you're reading a bunch of boring textbooks and like doing all this stuff that you don't care about. And coding's the same way. So I think it's this beautiful, and this is where it's like the AI moment is not specific to coding. I think this is actually across all of these disciplines where it's raising
Yeah.
the floor to get you to the place where like you can actually enjoy and do something cool. Ultimately, the feedback loop going back to like building expertise, like the outcome of that is not that expertise doesn't matter. It's that actually the premium of being an expert matters even more. And same thing with coding. Like what happens when 100 million people show up and start vibe coding? There's a ceiling of how far they can go. And who is it that's going to help them take the ceiling and go to the next level? Sure, there'll be
Yeah.
AI that helps, but it's also going to be professional developers. It's going to be people who actually have expertise and know how to code. And like that's why I'm so not worried about developers as a profession and as a
Yeah. Yeah.
domain.
I totally agree with you. One thing I'd love your thoughts on that I've noticed recently is so a couple of days ago, I went out for a couple of beers with some friends of mine, and we're having a great time. And um, one of them, these are two very technically proficient people. They're not developers, but they've written code, but they're not professional developers. And they're one of them is about my age, about 45 years old. The other guy is a little bit older, like 3 or 4 years older than me. And what I thought was interesting was they were both incredibly skeptical of AI. Um, and I don't know. I think part of it is that AI is the thing that everybody's talking about, and they're kind of wanting to be like and kind of like pushing back a little emo about things, if you will. Uh, but then also I've noticed, is that, and without wishing to sound ageist, that as people get further into their 40s and 50s and 60s, um, sometimes there's less of an appetite to explore new technologies. Now, this is obviously not the case in all scenarios, but I've noticed that there's a prevalence around like learning new tools, and especially when it comes to AI, um, in people who generally tend to be a little bit younger. So one of the things that worries me a little bit about adopting these amazing tools is for people who will push back against things just because they're popular and everybody's talking about it and it's on Hacker News every day. And people will be reluctant to dig into it because I've always done it this way. And those people in my mind are at the biggest risk of not benefiting the most from this, like everybody else. And it's not something I see people talking about a huge amount. What's your thoughts on how to get through to that audience, if you will? Because I'm a little worried that that group of people is going to get left behind a little bit.
One, like in an age where everyone is so hyped up about AI, I love skepticism. I'm like, there's nothing better than somebody being like, can AI really do that thing? Especially if it's a thing that AI can do, because you can like the time period to like show them that this thing is actually possible. It usually doesn't take that much work. Like to go and vibe code something cool is like a, order of 90 seconds and you could potentially have that aha moment.
Yeah.
And there's the like time to aha moment with AI is I think what makes it actually so viral in so many cases is it's just like
Yeah.
there's so many other things that you just have to like extend disbelief for longer versus this coding AI moment is like literally 90 seconds and you could see something awesome. So I appreciate the skepticism. I think people should be generally skeptical because there's
Yeah.
a lot of crazy claims going on or out there.
The challenge with them, I think specifically, or not just them, but other folks, is never even giving the vibe coding a go. But like, oh, if it's vibe coded, it's probably going to be crappy code that's not very good, not very useful. And then anyone who's actually vibe coded will be like, oh my goodness. I mean, yes, it's imperfect in many cases, but there's huge utility there, right? It's even just kind of in my mind, like going from 0 to 1 seems to be the challenge.
This is the product story of why it's important to meet, and my team talks about this all the time, like why it's important to meet developers where they are. There's so many surfaces where and I think you think about not like legacy but like traditional developer products, and like GitHub is a great example of this. Like all, for the most part, all of the world's developers live on GitHub or GitLab. If you can build a product experience that sort of subtly brings, whatever the behavior is that you want a developer to be able to see and understand and digest onto one of those platforms, you basically reach the entire developer community. That's not fully true. There's people who are running their own special instances of whatever versioning. Yeah, yeah, but it gets you a really long way. Um, so I do think this like and I think for vibe coding specifically, because there's a lot of nuance in like what product experience that you build. But my expectation is honestly, and I'm happy to opine on this point if it's interesting, but um I think almost every product is going to end up having this like software personalization. It's going to become so fundamental to, and like maybe it won't be builder slash developer slash vibe coding focus, but it'll be doing that behind the scenes. And it's a question of like how front and center is that in the experience. But I think it'll be like the AI chat UI, where like personalized on the fly developed software is going to happen everywhere. And the question is just like, how are you interfacing with that from a product perspective? So I think it's like I'm almost not super worried about like vibe coding and people's reaction to it as a phenomena or something that's happening, because I think it's just going to be so ever present that you're just not going to have the you could like choose to opt out, but in some way it's like not even going to be possible to do that, because like you'll just be forced to vibe code almost because it's so powerful.
Yeah, so it sounds like what you're saying is the pattern of interacting with the tools that you have in such a natural way, which is the whole point of vibe coding, will become so prevalent in everything we do in our lives that it will no longer seem unusual. So then you'll just go in and then you'll give it a go, and then you'll see the benefits, and you'll be kind of off to the races. Yeah.
Yeah. And just like, I mean, I think that extrapolates actually beyond vibe coding, but this is AI in general, which is you
Yeah.
look at like as the platform shift happens, it's like every company right now is like something AI. And like you look to the previous generation, there was like lots of companies with like cloud in the name and stuff like that as the cloud platform shift was happening, because you were trying to signal you were on the frontier. Eventually, it all just like goes away, and it's like all these companies go and remove the AI they go buy the .com domain, they remove AI from the name, and then it's just whatever the name of the company was.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think that happens because it's just a default part of the product experience.
Yeah. I totally agree. One thing I'd love to get your thoughts on, so especially within the context of developers, is I think for many years, developer onboarding has been not not in this case with everybody, but has been a relatively consistent set of steps, right? Like one of the things that we work on with a lot of our state shift customers is one of the first things we'll do is we'll kind of take a look at a company's developer onboarding process. We'll break it down into gates, and we'll figure out where people are dropping off, and then we'll provide like super practical recommendations to optimize people through the process. And the reason why we will start here is because you can do all of the promotion and marketing and whatever else in the world, but if people aren't able to get into your product or your project and do something, great within 10 minutes, then you kind of lost them. And it's usually, website, some kind of value, sign up, do some other kind of value, and it's a funnel, right? How do you think this is going to shift with developers and coding moving forward? Because I'll give you an example of that's inspiring this question. Is one of our customers is a large technology company that builds a lot of hardware. And they've got a big open source project that people can use to deploy on that hardware. And one of the things they're trying to figure out is how do we optimize kind of the customer journey or the project journey, how people just get up and running, how they enable a bit of hardware. And they were focusing on like lots of documentation. And my feedback to them was, I think we should load a bunch of this context into an LLM, and then somebody basically, you basically have a user interface where you can say, okay, tell us what your requirements are. And then it will either give you an image or it will give you exact step-by-step directions for how to get up and running with your particular use case. So it's essentially just walking you through the process. It's not that you have to navigate these sets of steps that are in the developer onboarding process. It's just handmade for you. And it got me thinking that this is probably going to be a pattern we're going to see in developer onboarding and engagement. But what's your thoughts on that, Logan?
Yeah, I'll give you our AI Studio product roadmap as the sort of analogy of my worldview on how to
Yeah.
solve this problem. We AI Studio is sort of the conduit for people to get access to the Gemini API. You need an API key to do that. One of the things that we're transitioning the product experience to do is like by default, when you sign up, we just make an API key for you behind the scenes. You're not like explicitly going and creating a button, which is what you do today. You click a button, you get an API key, you do something with it. We just make
Yeah.
that for you by default.
Makes sense.
The second thing is and this is unique to us in this, like, and I'm sure this carries across other contexts as well, and is also perhaps something that is unique to Google because of the sort of economic position that Google's in. But part of the experience that we want to land when people show up in AI Studio is, and I think there's a couple examples, and I'll give them, of like great AI products that do this, but you give people that wow factor initially by like doing more than they would expect. I think everyone is so used to this, like, pinch as many pennies as humanly possible, optimize this thing, you get 2 free queries, you get whatever. And like my mental model is like, we're just going to throw a ton of AI at this problem. And like for vibe coding as an example, like part of the vibe coding experience that we're building, instead of just giving you one thing when you show up, why not just make 4 apps for you and like give you
Yeah.
this, like, holy crap, this, like, wait a second, are they doing all the, and like without actually you even typing, like, the experience we want is you show up and it's just already, there's something is being vibe coded for you automatically. You didn't even type anything in. The product, it's just going, like the agent is just building
Love
something
that.
for you.
I
And you're like,
love
wait
that.
a second, like,
Yeah.
this is like, you're immediately pulled in. And I think this flips that like blank page, blank chat bot, text box problem on
Yeah.
its head, where like you
Which is a
automatically,
problem, a real, right?
yeah, it's a
Yeah.
real problem. I see this. I can see it in our user metrics. You show people a blank chatbot and they're like, they're actually not that interested.
Ah,
Um, so I
exactly.
think there's something where this like pulls you through the product experience. And again, like I acknowledge, like you need to be able to like have tokens to like spend money. And I don't know if like that long tail of startups would be able to do this. And it depends on, the lifetime value of your users and all that stuff of whether or not you could do something like that. But the analogy, the other product that I think does a great job of this, which continues to surprised me in this experience, is deep research. Deep research, you take a really ill-formed query of like, try to help you get market data on available playgrounds for your kids and what the best options are. And you can just something super vague. And the thing that like hits every time in that experience is you kick off that query, and in 20 seconds the model has gone and the agent has gone and visited and traversed like 75 different web pages. And you're like, holy crap, and I tell people this all the time, I would never have visited 75 web pages for anything. If I'm buying a car or a house or planning
Yeah.
my wedding, I'm not visiting 75 web pages. But then it doesn't stop there. It goes and visits another 400 web pages, and then you're like, okay, actually this thing did more than I would ever be able to do, and therefore
Yeah.
I am sort of imparting some trust into the tool.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. Yeah.
there's a downside to that, which is it needs to do a good job if you're going to impart your trust. But like that wow factor, I think really I think there's something magical there. And this is like the opposite of what most AI products, you have to go and do all this context gathering and like write the perfect prompt and give it access to your email and your calendar and your, mom's best friend's neighbor's, bank account in order to do something useful for you. And it's like, this is just a horrible experience. Like, just do something cool for me and show me that this will actually work. So I think
Yeah.
that,
The thing I love about that as well is that when you kick off one of those deep research queries, is that it will come back and it'll say, it'll ask you some questions to get a little bit more clarity about what you want. And what I love about that is, any kind of personalization we as human beings love, right? So, like you said, like you'll ask for a query, and even I think for people who think that I know how to prompt, right? It will come back and it'll gather information that will make it much more fine tuned. And I love this notion that you go in there somewhere a bit vague, but the platform or the tool is guiding you along the process. And I think historically with software, that's never been that good. Going back to the old days of like Microsoft Wizards and stuff like that, where it will get you kind of there, but it was always going to like leave off a bunch of edge cases. Now I think with AI, it's pretty good at that. It's pretty good at soliciting and getting more information from you to fine tune the experience. But it strikes me that it's going to completely shift the way in which we will onboard, right?
yeah. This deep research example, just to hit on this, I was in New York talking to the deep research team, and I was asking about this exactly. The interesting thing is that um, the total absolute percentage of people who change that plan that deep research comes up with and it prompts you is basically no one. Like you could basically like eliminate that feature and it wouldn't actually affect users. It is this like psychological bit, which is you are presented with this element of control and you feel like as the user you are able to go
Yeah.
and like instruct the model to do, but actually you don't. You just abdicate the responsibility to the model to go and do that for 99% of the time. And then maybe there's like the extreme edge case where you want to go in there and like manually tweak something, but by and large, like at least in the Gemini deep research, everyone is just abdicating responsibility to the model and it's like going off and doing the research, which is super. There's another interesting lesson there.
Yeah. It's so fascinating. What do you think? What do you think is the biggest shift in either mindset or approach that companies need to make in engaging with developers effectively? So if somebody's watching this and it might not even be an AI company, but they've got a company they have to engage with and attract developers in some way. In your years of experience, what do you think is the key thing that they need to focus on more than anything?
Yeah, it's a interesting question. I think one of the like general philosophies, in some cases to a downside, that I have is, or like I believe a lot of like Lulu Chen's her worldview of like how going direct matters, and like I think about this all the time, like in the way that we do our comms, the way that we engage with developers is like talking directly to the like minimal number of people between whoever is actually building the product and working on the product to the words that show up on the screen that the end developer actually sees is like the ideal case. Maybe this is a uniquely large company problem, but I think it's very easy for there to just like be lots of intermediaries between the developer and the actual product story that's happening. And I think as many people as possible as you can, like the founder, like if you are the founder of a developer tooling company, you should go and talk directly to the developers.
Yeah,
don't hire a marketing team, don't hire
yeah,
someone else to do it. Like don't hire, like actually, like in some cases, like, and I don't know what your experience is, John, working with companies that do this, like don't hire a DevRel team. Like as
no,
long as humanly possible, you should be the person who's engaging the ecosystem and community. Only after it becomes physically impossible for you to keep up should you go and hire one person to help you.
yeah,
And that should be like the most authentic person possible to go and do this. And actually, we should double click on this. And I'm curious what your perspective is. But my take on like who should be doing the DevRel work has also shifted over time, where like I've become biased in that I think it's like the product and engineering teams need to be doing more of this. And I think there's something interesting where like you buy, and I felt this now having like lived through the world of like doing DevRel versus being in a product position and also doing DevRel. Is like I feel so much more credibility and agency to go and talk to developers now as a as a PM than I actually did as someone who was in developer relations. I was always like, oh yeah, well, let me go and try to convince people to solve that problem. And now I show up and somebody complains about something, I'm like, yep, we're solving that problem. That is my job is to solve that problem. My job is not anything else other than to solve the problem that these users have. And
Yeah, yeah.
there's something interesting there.
I totally agree with you. I remember discovering a similar thing when I was at Canonical, and um, I reported into Mark Shuttleworth, who founded Canonical, and he'd have like new roles because I was one of the first non-engineering roles in the company, and then they'd report into Shuttleworth for a year or so, and then he would move people into another team so he could not have 1,000 direct reports. Um, and we had a conversation about this, like where I should go in, because we didn't have a head of marketing at the time. So I ended up basically sitting in on the engineering management team. And it was the best decision I think anyone could have made, because to your point, like there was a real sense, again, agency and being part of it. And that I had a close relationship, a really close relationship with the other engineering managers. I wasn't an engineering manager myself, but it was part of that. And we have the same view with the companies that we work with, which is, the closer you get into the engineering, it's interesting what you said about founders as well. I think you're 100% right. Like getting out there, I don't think you can outsource in a really early stage company. I don't think you can outsource this effectively, because you need to know those developers inside out. I think whether that's the founder or whether that's going to be a member of the engineering team, but certainly even if you do bring a DevRel in, having them report into engineering, I think makes a ton of sense.
Yeah, it's a
It's
I think it's also changed my perspective on the challenge is DevRel is this like bucket of things that, and I'm sure you talk to companies about this all the time. So I'm curious what your take is on this, but I feel like DevRel is just this umbrella where the chances of something going wrong is really high, is like my honest
Yeah,
opinion. Like people don't understand. It's like everywhere you go, every company you go to, they're like, we have to prove that DevRel makes sense. We have to do it. And it's like no one, with the exception of like Brian Chesky at Airbnb, needs to prove that product makes sense. Everyone is on board that we should have product people. Everyone's on board that we need an engineering team. And it's
yeah,
like, what is dev? And like everyone thinks we should do marketing, and it's like, and comms and all this other stuff and talking to users. And it's like DevRel is this intersection of all three of those things. And yet it's like always a debate of whether this thing should exist. And I'm like, my mental model is I'm like, short circuit the whole debate, stick them in one of those teams, have them do
yeah,
outward facing work, save yourself the hassle of having to, explain to executives why you have this function, all that stuff. I feel like it's the path of
yeah.
least resistance, and you get like 98% of the upside.
I agree, and I think that what's happened in recent, I think we went through this period of time with DevRel where a lot of companies hired DevRel people, and there wasn't a layer of um, accountability. So what would happen is you get these DevRel people who would be very well-meaning people who will go out and do what DevRel people do. They go to conferences and create content, whatever else, and then it was the same pattern. Like a year into that person being there, someone would say, why are we investing in this role? Why don't we redirect the money and put it somewhere else? And there wasn't a particularly good answer to that question in many of these companies. When we work with folks, we always start with, okay, how do you measure the efficacy of this work? And then ideally, you have that role reporting directly into engineering. For exactly those reasons. I think the days of just flying people to the conferences, they just don't make a lot of sense in my mind. So, um, well, Logan, I want to be really respectful of your time. I know you're a busy guy, you got a lot going on, and I appreciate you spending some time with me here today. Where would you, for people who are interested in learning more about you and your work and what you're doing at Google, where would you point them towards?
Let's chat on X. I mean, I'm on LinkedIn and email and everything else as well. But the AI, which is also, this is a separate, what we could opine for another hour about this, about um, the magic of like bringing this like ecosystem and community together, and like for all the downsides of X and Twitter, like it's where the AI conversation is happening. And I
Yeah,
think if you're interested in that conversation, like I'm having part of the conversation on X and on Twitter. So come hang out and say hi.
awesome. Well, thanks, man. Appreciate you joining us.
Yeah, this was a ton of fun, Jono. Thank you.